Right. So, good morning and welcome, everyone. This is the fifth webinar in our ongoing behavioral health series, where we're really aiming to provide some strategies and tools to help address concerns around youth mental health. So, we all know that you are witnessing firsthand and programming kiddos who are struggling with sadness or hopelessness right now. And we hope that you leave our webinar today with a few more tools to help you tackle some of those challenges. So my name is Jennifer Smith. I'm a program coordinator with the Wisconsin After School Network, which is a program of the Marshfield Clinic Health Systems Center for Community Health Advancement. That's a lot of words. And I'll be facilitating our webinar today. So this series is made possible through a partnership between the Wisconsin After School Network and the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families. And we wouldn't be here today without the support and expertise of Marshfield Clinic's behavioral health team and the expertise of all of our amazing guest speakers. So before we start, I do want to remind everyone, if you can keep your microphones on mute. And if you have questions, you can certainly put them in the chat. Carlin, our speaker today, and I will be monitoring that as they come in. It's also helpful to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to the Wisconsin After School Network's YouTube channel within a couple of weeks. So you can revisit the content or share this with someone else who you think might be interested in joining in this conversation. Our next webinar in the series will take place on April 24th. So please keep a lookout for future messages about registration to that webinar. We will also invite you to participate in 5 questions in a poll at the end of this session, where we are asking you to provide us with some feedback. And we appreciate you taking a few minutes of your time so we can reflect on these resources that we put together and ensure we are meeting all of your needs with what we are providing. So with all of our logistics aside, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Carlin Andrew. This is Carlin's 12th year with the Boys and Girls Club of the Fox Valley, leading organizational safety and trauma-informed implementation, talent development and continuous improvement strategy, youth and family counseling, human resources, and bringing sources of strength an upstream suicide prevention program to all high schools in the local Tri-County region. Carlin's got a lot on her plate. She's an ambassador between her organization and her community, region, state, and the movement bridging efforts related to mental health, suicide prevention, and resiliency, and a founding member of the Community Alliance for Trauma-Informed Care in the Fox Cities. Carlin's background is in school counseling and providing youth, adolescent, and family mental health counseling. She's dually licensed in the state of Wisconsin as a school counselor and a licensed professional counselor with additional certification in trauma, earning her degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. So thank you, Carlin, for being here with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jen, and good to meet you all and to be here with you all. Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure and one of my most excited things to talk about whenever we're supporting young people in all aspects of mental health. And so our emphasis today is on those hard conversations. Could I just get a thumbs up from someone so I can make sure you're on my screen okay? It should be real bright and saying hard conversations. Lovely. Okay, lots of head nods. So thanks for coming together. And as Jen said, please feel free to contribute to the chat and we'll try to take a peek at addressing those pieces that come up. What our time will look like together today will include just some brief recapping of state of youth mental health and creating some conditions for conversations and connecting that to brain and stress response and appropriately and strategically timing those strategies for supporting social emotional development based on what parts of the brain are accessible with this conversation that you're hoping to have with young people. And along the way, a lot of a review of the helpful words and phrases to use and to say. Does that sound okay? All right, I see some head nods. Thank you. So a couple of things about what things look like, and this is no new information to you all who work with young people every single day, but just in that grounding place of things looking difficult. And when we're talking about the hard that some young people are kind of carrying in their backpacks and on the weight of their shoulders, that they enter your spaces and programs and services every day, this might be part of what is going on in that place where young people are not just in a place of stress or in a, oh goodness, this feels a little difficult, but that there could also be things going on that are meeting diagnostic criteria that could be contributing to what's making things hard and complicated right now. So you can see some different stats across the screen. I know there's different high ones that we look at in different pieces. And the numbers are not what's important. It's just the understanding and the foundation that if something's feeling particularly hard or difficult, there could also be something additional going on that might be helpful to tune into. And that goes also for, as we know, the very high prevalence of trauma, and that, 2/3 of young people report having experienced at least one traumatic event by their 16th birthday. 1 in 7 have experienced substantiated child abuse and neglect. So these are really hard things that people, our young people, are dealing with. So an equation that I sometimes like to think about when I'm with a young person and I'm trying to sort out, hard is hard. It doesn't matter the size of it. It's big, and that's why it's feeling hard right now. But when I'm trying to sort out, is this hard accompanied with a mental health condition? So how can I be a support person to this young person? And how might I be able to connect them to additional helps and supports or treatment if there's some additional layers going on? And borrowed from the Youth Mental Health First Aid curriculum, it's this idea: if there are a lot of symptoms, so if there are a lot of things that are going on, it may be a lot of weepiness or disrupted thoughts, those things are contributing to the way that they live, laugh, and love in life. Their friend relationships, their school relationships, their relationships with caregivers or adults, how they're doing in academic work or how they're doing with extracurriculars. If it's atypical to what's typical for that young person, those two kind of combine can suggest that someone would meet criteria for a mental health condition. And that could be something that's making the hard feel or be extra hard. So we are not going to focus the emphasis on our time today, but I also didn't want to do a disservice to some of the conditions that could be present when we enter hard conversations, and to always make sure we have this in our back pocket. What I would instead just like to offer, if you're having a level of curiosity and saying, oh, I think I have opportunity to, improve my mental health literacy, or improve the mental health literacy of our other team members, and hone in on the very specific conversation around, I think this young person could also benefit from being connected, to professional mental health treatment or counseling in some way. A really great curriculum out there is the Mental Health First Aid curriculum, and that's not the emphasis of our time together today. But I didn't want to just say there's more information and not point you in a direction. And I can also offer and say, if you've got a group of 15, 20 people in your organization and your community, I'm happy to work on coordinating with you and connect you and your team members to this training. Thanks to some grant funding, we have connections to bring that at no cost to you. So my email's on that screen if that feels like something that would be beneficial to you. But with that, we're really going to pivot away on an emphasis on mental health conditions. And as I said, use that really as the foundation to understand that there could be additional factors at play during those hard conversations. But whether someone has additional mental health conditions or needs, What we will talk about has application for anyone, for all young people, and frankly, for a lot of those hard adult conversations that we have too, with the people in our lives. So on to the focus of those hard conversations. First and foremost, we want to set desirable conditions for hard conversations. To do that, we need to get really good at regular conversations. And the best way to do that with young people is to give them your time. We get better with practice, and so do our young people. And when we make regular connection and conversation the norm during typical times, it makes it that much better when we had conversations, because the buildup or this kind of fear or anxiousness that, oh gosh, this is a big one, this is an important one, is such, the stakes don't feel as high because this is just what we do as often as we're able. We're in connection and we're in conversation with each other. And the nature of the topic doesn't have to be so scary. These are conversations. And when we are really good at getting good at this ourselves, our young people will get good at this with us. So what are those conditions? You know, sometimes, and importantly so, we do a lot of paying attention to, well, what's different for youth, or how does it land differently for youth? And I'll mention a couple of those things, but also a lot of the things that we appreciate as adults are things that our young people appreciate too. And so not to think that it's entirely different set of rules, but that a lot of the things that we would offer another adult, such as privacy of the setting, or that a bunch of other people aren't in earshot of the conversation, is a really great starting point. So some of those factors that we would, you know, unequivocally offer another adult are among those same conditions that we should offer a young person. Some others would include things like using pauses. There's a lot of settle into the pause and use the pause. And there's an irony that if you take the words silent, it's actually just listen, jumbled up in a different order. And there's that proverb about we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we may do twice as much listening as we do speaking. And so the best part, and I think this is like the relief moment of we're off the hook initially. We don't have to work so hard in the hard conversations. We have to work so hard at saying a lot less, especially in the beginning. There's information out there that speaks to a processing time, like an audio processing time for people in conversation or generating input from others and making decisions about what they want to share with others, that in a stressed state, it's nearly double. A typical state falls within normal limits of about 20 seconds. That was 5. And so our pacing and the amount of silence we are initially using in conversations is going to be a really helpful place. And the more we seek to not fill the space and fill the quiet, the more likely the person we're with is going to do so. And we understand and know all these pieces. The conversation and where it initially starts is never kind of the poignant moment. There's the initial share, and then you just kind of go with the tell me more, say more, what else, keep going, and just those head nods along the way. And you just have them keep adding on and adding on and adding on with lots of silence and lots of prompts that communicate verbally or non-verbally that idea of tell me more, say more, what else, keep going, right? You know, in there, then there starts being those ideas of reflections and paraphrases. We know all those things, you know, having people have their feelings shared back to them that they've offered, or summarizing what they've offered and sharing that back. but it can be most helpful after you've done a great deal of the pausing and the keep going, the pausing and the keep going. So we can begin to kind of hear a bigger message about what's going on. Ask questions. General rule is to use a lot of open-ended questions, but if you use a closed-ended question, we know we have the magic tools of tell me more, say more, what else? Keep going if they're able to just shrug a shoulder. So some of those starting points are back to basics of active listening. And this sometimes feels like, oh my gosh, I carved out an hour for this webinar and we're talking about reflections and paraphrasing. That's right. This is the foundation of it, because it's often what we underappreciate or we kind of glide past. And so we really want to dedicate our time to creating space for these things. Saying things like, here's what you need to do. I think you should. If I were you, you better is definitely what not to say. That is advice giving, and it's generally unhelpful unless someone very specifically asks, I could use some advice. And even then, sometimes when they very specifically ask, they tend to be looking for a thought partner, a brainstormer, someone to hear them. More often than not, advice giving is experienced as being dismissive, and it can actually leave people with feelings of disempowerment. This idea of that I don't have the resources or skills or abilities to solve my own problems, and I need to come to you to be able to solve a problem. And so solutions that people are involved in generating are solutions that are much more likely to lead to action. And so we want to kind of avoid those temptations to tend toward that advice giving path, and instead ask questions, open-ended questions about, what do you think would fix this? What ideas do you have? But we'll get more on that in a little bit. I have the opportunity to be in touch with a lot of young people, and when I prompt them around how can adults show up for you, here are some of the things that they say back. I'll give you a moment to take in what's on the screen. They tend to focus on having that listener and that person creating the space and the time and the connection. They don't tend to talk about the person who gives me a complete plan and tells me all the steps A to Z about what to do. And it's this idea of listening, really being a way that care and compassion is really experienced. There's also this kind of quote from Catherine Wallace that goes, listen earnestly to anything your children want to tell you, no matter what. If you don't listen eagerly to the little stuff when they are little, they won't tell you the big stuff when they are big, because to them, all of it has always been the big stuff. And there are a lot of ways. I know none of us, we are a helping profession, many of whom are nonprofit. None of us come into this work and think anything other than really good intentions and really coming from that strong purpose of just wanting to do right by young people and help young people. And we're also up against a lot of really difficult norms in the way young people are brought up in their homes. And sometimes we reflect back and repeat back the behaviors that were used in our own home. And so sometimes that looked a lot like, oh, those are big feelings, go to your room and work those out and don't come back until those are all handled, or tears are for the pillow, and some of these things that are going on. And so there's a really strong embedded way where young people are given communication that says, those are big feelings, go handle those on your own, and please come back when it's worked out. And then all of a sudden, what happens is when they become adolescents and high schoolers, a lot of adults are bewildered as to why those teens are not approaching adults with their difficulties. And it's because of our own doing of having told them a very opposite message time and time again during a lot of those early years. So whether or not this is something that you had actually said to a young person or inadvertently could have communicated like, oh, this isn't important because it didn't seem important in that moment, we are up against the messages they've been getting from a big volume of adults their entire lives about those are little problems or those are confusing problems, work them out and come back when they're worked out. And so it takes so much of our repetition and time and practice in conversation to compete against and to create a new message of adults can be trustworthy. Adults do care about your feelings. Adults do want to work those out alongside you. And you can share your hard and that's okay. All of those things can be okay. So that's why it requires so much practice and rehearsal, because we are up against a lot of contrary messages from a lot of other adults, whether that's in the home or the school or other youth organization settings. So doing these things really help create those favorable conditions to really best navigate those hard conversations. And we want to help young people develop and strengthen their problem-solving skills. We want them to hear us say, that's a problem. There is a solution to every problem, or that's a problem and we can solve problems. So when our young person's brain is focused on whatever the hard is, the problem you're most on is understanding and reading the context of the current scenario to ensure that your young person is in their thinking brain so that they can access the most effective problem solving. So I'm going to spend a couple of moments to just ground and reorient us to kind of the brain in some basic terms so we can get really good at interpreting where a young person is, so we understand our starting point and really help them re-achieve their thinking brain being fully accessible. So if you think of the brain in three primary areas, and so many of you I know are kind of familiar with that hand gesture of, you think you have the brain stem, and the brain stem is really concerned with survival, all the things like biological needs, shelter, food, water, safety. The survival brain is all about the being alive and those very basic functions, with safety being of utmost importance. The midbrain in here is the limbic system, and there are all sorts of pieces in there. And a really key one is the amygdala. And the amygdala, we all know, is that one that sends the alarms and kind of applies meaning to different sensory inputs and triggers the alarms to the different parts of the brain and saying, oh, there's a problem, or oh, things are smooth. Okay. And then the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain, up here in the front, contains all that executive functioning. That's the thinking brain. And that's what we want to be accessible and fully functioning for a young person, because that's things like prioritization, it's things like sequence, it's things like applying insight and problem solving and collaboration and discussing future behaviors and future ways to plan or to do things. So in a perfect scenario, in an ideal circumstance, when we are at baseline, when we are at our typical functioning, our full brain is accessible and all things are moving along swimmingly. But what can happen is that at that point of activation, if there's some sort of sensory input that comes in, whether it's the loud slam of a door, whether it's the smell of something that relates to an earlier experience in our life, whether it's the furrowed brow of a caregiver or an adult in the room, and it relates to kind of the judgment or the need for approval from some some caregivers elsewhere in life, there's this activator that happens. And as soon as that activator happens, there's a flood of hormones in the body that then begin to say, oh, we might want to be on alert. And that's when the amygdala starts doing its thing and saying, hey, there's something we want to look at here. And this is when we're in escalation. This is when this escalation is happening. And the brain already kind of pulls the prefrontal cortex offline because it's trying to be really efficient. And it's saying, hey, there's some new information. We should probably redirect all available resources to other parts of the brain right now, because it's possible that there is a threat going on. And in this happening, the body is being flooded with cortisol, and the amygdala really quickly has like the brain stem, that survival part of the brain, on push notifications. And it has the prefrontal cortex like still on snail mail. And so the problem is that the brain is going to always seek to prioritize survival because it thinks it's doing people a solid. And the difficulty is that sometimes it's just an activator that is not related to the current scenario. But in that moment, that brain and that body does not understand that moment. And now there's a flood of hormones in the body that are now working kind of against that brain and body around current scenario. Okay. So in these moments, this is when only the midbrain, the limbic system, and the survival parts of the brain are available in escalation. And sometimes this kind of can send people into a frenzy, or sometimes well-intended but misinformed helpers can really reactivate an escalation and can make things worse, where now the only parts of the brain when we're in full dysregulation, when we're in crisis, would be the survival part of the brain. Sometimes what that looks like is a lot of the behaviors, or excuse me, a lot of the strategy used in some systems are really cognitive behavioral based for kind of support strategies or classroom management strategies, where there's a lot of emphasis on hey, what are you doing and what do you need? And what could you do differently next time? Which can be really helpful processing questions in a debrief when a young person is back at stabilization and baseline, because those are cognitive questions that require the prefrontal cortex to be online and accessible. And so when we enter into a scenario where someone is in escalation and we are asking a lot of thought and cognitive based questions, we are actually reactivating, and then we are continuing to escalate the scenario. Then in kind of crisis, as I said, the only parts of the brain are survival. And we have that understanding. That's that flight, fight, freeze, fawn. This is when people go, and we don't always have exactly the same ones. Sometimes it's setting based, environment based. Sometimes it's activator based as to what ones they look like. But this is where people move toward those survival-based ways that they navigate their life and their world. And they move to these because they've had to at other times in their life that has served them and that have worked. And so this is what's going on, and that it is not a conscious decision of what's going on in these moments. Really, this is the brain and the body functioning pretty subconsciously because we are just in a survival state. So we want to pay attention to, let's make sure we're satisfying the different parts of the brain, and that we're beginning to engage in conversation and connect and engage with a young person with understanding of what's accessible to them right now and how can we get them back in that thinking brain. And so, like, out of the conscious discipline body of work, think of it as the brain stem is asking, am I safe? And the limbic system is asking, am I connected? And the thinking part of the brain is then when we can ask, what can I learn? And kind of folding in the neurosequential body of work from Dr. Bruce Perry, we can then connect our strategies to regulate, relate, then reason, when someone is in full dysregulation. We want to start from the bottom of the brain and then move up and to connect those strategies to what parts of the brain is accessible. So these are considered the 3 R's: regulate, relate, reason. And there are very specific things that we can do to help make sure we're getting a young person connected to their full thinking brain, so then we can be in very productive and meaningful conversation. So when we are in that kind of, we observe someone in full dysregulation, or quite frankly, sometimes we don't know if someone is escalating or if they are in full dysregulation, it can be really helpful to just start with regulation, because you will quickly get feedback. If that person's able to communicate back with you calmly and they're able to achieve a calm body with you, then you just move on from this step really quickly, right? And these are all things, we said survival brain cares about the biology, the basics. And so this is actually not talking necessarily. This is doing things with your body, overtly modeling and explicitly modeling. So doing it with your own body and inviting them to join you, because you're going to be doing a couple of different things by doing that. One, you're going to model for them what you'd like them to do, which creates some behavioral mirroring, that it gives them a visualization of what a desired behavior in that moment looks like, instead of just directing and dictating that they do some behaviors. And so you want to think about activating any or all of the 5 senses: touch, sound, smell, hearing. I'm missing a sense. Someone help me in the chat, right? Activating all of our senses. And so this is where you might say, wow, you're approaching something and you're going to say, hey, let's take a few breaths together. And you're not just going to say, hey, breathe. You're going to say, I can feel that things are tense in here, so I'm going to do some breaths. Would you please do these with me? And you just then do it without worrying if they're immediately joining you or not. You just start joining it, right? So you do some breathing, or you say, hey, like, let's grab our fist and release. Let's squeeze really tight, really, really tight. Okay. Let's do that with our biceps really tight. Okay. And let's relax. Okay. So you're trying to create and you're trying to activate their sensations in their body. And you're doing that by overtly modeling, and you're doing it by demonstrating it yourself. This in turn creates co-regulation, and it gives them something to tether onto when their body is feeling very chaotic. And so that saying often goes that we want them to join our calm, not us to join their chaos. But we have to keep our own pace and tone and body and breathing slow and low and calm and controlled, because a dysregulated person has never regulated anyone. And if we ourselves are not regulated and able to maintain a calm body, we're not going to have success in helping someone else achieve that in them. Something you might do in some scenarios, it could be appropriate to say, I can tell this conversation is beginning to heat up. And so what I want to do is call a pause to this conversation. And so we can engage in some strategies and come back together. Totally okay. And to my earlier comments of, I'm not suggesting a break or a timeout or a pause from a conversation is never appropriate. But what we want to do is to model the, oop, I can feel my chest is getting hot and I don't want to continue in this conversation if I can't fully show up how I want to. So I need to call a pause to this conversation because I'm recognizing in my body about how I'm starting to show up. And then when you come back together, you have conversation about what you did during that alone time and that solitude time to get back into that calm place. And then you re-engage in the conversation. So a pause, a break, totally okay when we close the loop. And when we do come back together and we talk about what we did, and then we're able to continue progressing in that conversation. What's not helpful or productive is yelling. And what is not helpful or productive are saying things like calm down or relax. Just and do that with your own body and create invitation for those to join you. Some very specific strategies you could use is the 4 square breathing. There are so many different breathing exercises out there, and 4 square breathing looks like this. If you feel so inclined to join me, please do. If you'd prefer not, that's just fine. So it looks like this, where you can you breathe in for 4, and then you hold for 4, and then you breathe out for 4, and you kind of progress, and it can help if you're like tracing along. So if you're willing, we'll start up at the top, and we can breathe in for 4. Breathe in and hold and out and hold. Thank you for those that were able to join. So just one example of a type of exercise that you could do and have available in the spaces that you frequently serve young people. So there's a quick resource and reference for them to do breathing with you. Now, a different kind of, because we said activating lots of senses, sometimes doing something explosive or energizing that's safe can be a really great way to also get someone back in their body. So thinking about if someone is really feeling that need for movement, and like sitting and breathing isn't working or isn't feeling right for that young person, you could say, let's do some giant frog jumps, or let's do some push-ups against the wall. Because sometimes creating a safe energy in the body is another way that we can create that regulation, because it can be really reclaiming. And when we're in those survival moments, it generally is associated with feelings of powerlessness. And so doing some energizing exercises can help create that reclaim. So we want to do regulate. And when someone is able to maintain a relaxed body, that tells you that kind of the emotional part of the brain has come back online. When they're able to have a more typical paced breathing, that is when, okay, we've got this person back. So this sometimes is also where we can be quick to jump to like, whew, I'm glad we moved beyond that. Now, like, what was that about? And what could we do? And here again, it's not time for thinking strategies. It's not time for problem solving yet, because we need to satisfy that, am I connected? What is the meaning of this? And that's what we're doing when we're in relate. So that first bullet there is just creating space to our earlier conversation about silence. Just creating much more slower pace and doing a lot of listening as you are doing the relating. And you want to listen to understand, not just to respond. Here, you might lean on use of self-disclosure to connect, while being sure that you're not applying your own lived experience to theirs, and being sure that you're bridging it back. It's okay for us to say, oh my gosh, when you talk about just being blindsided by the news of the divorce, it really brings me back to when that was going on with my parents. And I remember that was a lot. What's the biggest part of it for you? Like, we have to pass it back to the young person. And sometimes our lived experience and our wisdom and that crave to be helpful and take pain away from young people can sometimes send our self-disclosure into the like, and here's what I did, and here's what you need to do. And then it becomes very advice giving. And so I'm not suggesting you never share a piece of yourself. If that feels meaningful and appropriate, it can be really strengthening and rapport building. And we do want to make sure it's appropriately sized, and we do want to hand it back to the young person in their experience. And we also want to make sure we're not recalling upon something that is an open ouch for us in our lives. If there's something that we're openly navigating and working through, then this is not something we should be using in our professional work, because it might open up something too tender. And that's not the time or space to do that when we are in our work with young people. You want to use a staying position. So here you want to create physical plants, whether that's quite literally being seated or taking a knee or leaning on a counter or leaning on a wall, but you want to create a physical difference with your plant that communicate that I'm with you. I'm staying in this conversation. And some small tips are around, like, in what direction are your toes pointed if you're standing? Because if your toes are pointed away, it can sometimes be communicating like, I've got places to be and things to do, right? So some of your words here are more of that, tell me more, help me understand. How are you feeling? How long have you been feeling that way? You might ask, where do you feel it in your body? What's the size of the feeling? And you want to state that it is, not what it is. You want to validate what they're offering without drawing conclusions about what they are offering, because we want to help people come to their own insight and their own connections. And we can do that by asking questions. But we don't want to say, oh, you're feeling so stressed because of that news that happened, and therefore XYZ. Right? Because then we're doing a lot of connections and concluding, and we usually are missing some very important pieces of the story, and that can kind of take a conversation in a different direction. We want to stay in that place of keep going, tell me more, say more about that. What else? What makes that important, right? Like, we want to get to that place of those more questions. State that it is, not what it is. Feelings don't need to make sense. They don't need to be rational. They don't need to make they don't need to make a lot of sense to us, but they most definitely are real for the person, and they most definitely are valid. If someone could just make the feeling go away, they would. And the fact that they're unable to and are in this hard place is because right now that doesn't feel possible. And so when we are dismissive or say, well, you're not feeling that, or that's not how it is, that only makes the feeling feel that much more powerful. And then it only becomes a creator of disconnection, where they're saying, I'm not going to go back to this person again, right? Because when we're talking about relationships and we're saying our work on getting good at these conversations, what makes young people come back to conversations? When they have a positive experience in conversation with us. What stops them from coming to conversation with us? When they don't have good experiences. When they continue to have positive experiences in conversation with us, they will continue coming back. One of the pieces that can be really helpful here is to really encourage emotional granularity. And it's kind of that idea of like the name it to tame it body of work. And we have to recognize that for some, it's more express it to address it. It need not always be language or talk based. Sometimes we don't have the words to convey our feelings or our thoughts. And sometimes name it to tame it isn't exactly the way that where we are just yet in our emotional development. But when we use other forms of communication like movement or sound or play, this can be other ways that that are really transformative and restorative when like language communication is not always available. What we want to be working toward is helping people get to that place of having more feelings accessible for them to be able to express and speak to. Sometimes we live in that mad, sad, glad place, and that just doesn't put it so clearly, or it doesn't really fully get at it. And that kind of like your brain and your body knows that. And when you're like, oh, I was just frustrated and like you leave it there, there's something about the like why that frustration still continues to fester is because frustration maybe wasn't quite it. Like that kind of just didn't fully get it. Or like wow, like I felt really overwhelmed. Like I wasn't just nervous or anxious, I felt overwhelmed. And so when we can kind of get better at putting our finger on what it is that's going on, that kind of helps create that relief because we're naming it and we're able to understand it a little better. And then it's helping that kind of satisfying that mid part of the brain in the meaning making of what might have been going on. So here again, there's a lot of tools available, a feelings wheel or things like the mood meter, things that you can use for the mood meter, or sometimes just having them say like, what color, just get them in a quadrant and getting them to speak to that can be a helpful starting point. Some really important things here to notice and pay attention to are that our culture has a really hard time with feelings, and we tend to disguise our opinions and our beliefs as feelings. When you hear the word like used behind the word feel, that is not a feeling, it is a belief or an opinion. So when it's, I feel like you don't care, that's an opinion. The feeling, and then you say, and what does it feel like when you feel like I don't care? Right. And this is really hard because we struggle with this in the US, we struggle with this in the Midwest, right? When we are a really high work ethic culture. And to get to the like, like I feel embarrassed, right? Like whatever that is, help them get to that place. So you want to listen for the I feel likes and help prompt and what feeling is that for you? Because that's how we're not just artificially satisfying the midbrain, that we're actually more adequately satisfying and fulfilling the needs of that relate part and that midbrain of am I connected? And that's when we can get back to the reasoning. So we have those conditions earlier in our time together today we talked about that are going to create good and favorable conditions for those conversations. And then here is where we can fold in more of those development of insight and problem solving. This is where you can begin to help them get to a point of like, I wonder how, or I wonder if, and use a lot of tentative language when you're helping to model brainstorming and collaboration and thought partnering. You can say, how can we solve this problem? Or would you consider, or would you be open to a suggestion? And that just changes the feel so strongly. And like, what makes this important to you? What we don't want to be doing is toxic positivity, where we're just offering pacifying statements around like good vibes only or positive thoughts only allowed, or these kind of little platitudes if we're placing it on someone else. If someone is offering their own mantra, that is wonderful. You can absolutely settle into that if that's something that someone's offering that they are using is meaningful to them. But we don't want to be dismissive to their feelings or their experience and kind of moving toward that toxic positivity place. And we certainly don't want to do the shoulding. That can be a lot like the advice giving and can be disempowering. So this can be a place where you maybe help kind of fill that glass from the bottom up and create that insight and development, and to say, hey, what is it that you are needing? This is where you can get to the movement, and you can just use some different needs inventory graphics to help create, like, I was really needing to feel like I'm to be mattered. I was really needing connection, or I find myself really needing whatever it might be. There might be some different ways that it can help them connect to those different insights that could be going on. And then you can educate on some more positive activators. You can fold this into the conversation. And this is times where you can say, I'd love to offer something I've learned. Would you be open to hearing that? And say, like, one thing I found is that moving my body in regular exercise has been something that helps for me. It kind of releases those endorphins. And do you know about those? And what are the things that you're doing that are your positive activators? Because so much of the conversation is often centered around activators or triggers. But we really can have this conversation that I hear referred to as our glimmers. What are we doing to activate those positive activators? in this thinking part of the brain, it also creates space for us to reframe the hard. And so this idea that all of the hard does not mean it's a bad thing, all stress is not bad, that we can really begin to reframe sensations that are associated with nerves as excitement. There's this beautiful study that was done about the possibilities that were accessible by someone just saying, those butterflies, name them as excitement. When you're standing in the wings to go on stage of your piano recital, or when you know your name is getting called up to read your poem in English class, tell yourself that's excitement and it's telling me I care about this. And how we can really begin to exercise and create some reframes around what could be going on for ourselves. So our brain doesn't automatically assume the only association for these sensations are bad or dangerous. This idea of things being within our perceived coping skills. When things feel like they're sending over the edge, it's often centered on this idea of it feels like it's beyond coping. And this is really where the body of work and settling into the power of yet becomes really meaningful. As soon as they say, I can't do that, just nudge them to practice saying yet. All skills can be learned. All skills can be strengthened. And that if you don't know how to do something, it's not yet. And that anything is within our ability to learn and within our ability to navigate if we put the time and effort into doing that. So as we begin to round out our time before we open up for some questions, the kind of key things I just want to highlight is this idea of really bridging time and trust in our conversations, and really using and reading where this young person is in the conversation to start the conversation, to make sure we're getting them to that thinking part of the brain, and to remember those ideas about not all stress is bad, so not all hard is bad. And some of this is about the power of yet and reframing those sensations and helping them really explore what those glimmers can be in their life. So I have a prompt for you. If you're so willing to offer some reflections back of what you took in, if you'd maybe consider sharing in on one of these prompts, the head, heart, feet reflection, either something you learned, something that touched you, or something you're walking away with. And then as you're doing that, Jen will scan the chat for me and let me know what things we might want to talk more about.
So lots of questions, Carlin, of if you'd be willing to share your PowerPoint with us.
Sure, I can do that.
So we can make it a PDF and you and I can talk offline. But I think there's a lot of valuable information that people are really interested in having access to that you shared with everybody today. I'm looking to see, there were a couple questions earlier. Yeah, mostly the questions are, will this be available afterwards? There was one question about if we have something that we think would be helpful for a young person that we're talking with. Well, I guess I'm not sure what context this was in. I asked about if it would be advice giving. But I think it was in the regulate part. Sorry, that wasn't a very helpful question.
I think another thing that the folks would like addressed is the fight, flight, fawn, and freeze. I think a lot of us are familiar with the first two, and the second two are kind of new to the field a little bit. If you could speak a little more to that.
Sure, happy to. Let me go back there. Okay, so flight, fight, freeze, fawn. Sometimes fawn is the one that feels a little bit more newer to folks. And this is especially in when there are more prolonged and persistent exposures to lots of toxic stress. Fawn is when people are in a place of very strongly people pleasing, maybe at the sense of their lack of regard for their own needs and really over elevating the needs of others. So this is sometimes coming from a place of when there's a lot of needing to predict difficulty and then adjust your own behavior in a ways that's going to help other people, or having some at times difficult, like unhealthy codependence or kind of unhealthy attachment. Sometimes this can be when there's a perception of doing things for yourself is only selfish, or if I ever tell someone no, or if I ever can't create space or time because it would create a difficulty for me, that it then means I'm a bad person, or that I'm not worthy, or I am not loved. This idea of everyone else's needs mattering most and at the cost of my own needs is kind of this idea of fawn. I think sometimes when we're in conversation and learnings around any of these survival responses, sometimes we think of the most exaggerated sense of like, someone quite literally sprinting out in a kind of flight kind of way. And sure, it can look like people quite literally leaving the space or running or fleeing, but also like think about some equivalents you probably are familiar with in the workplace, or maybe you've even used yourself. Flight can look a lot like, I'm going to not go to work on that day because I can't stand that meeting because my opinions aren't heard. It's never. And so this idea of avoidance behaviors, or the like, oh, this is when I'm going to sit back and just scan through my phone because I'm going to mentally check out of this, whatever this might be. It's not always in the most exaggerated sense of what these look like. And same with fight. Sometimes it's put your dukes up, and that is what it looks like. But again, a workplace equivalence could be, maybe those who tend toward kind of linguistic gymnastics anytime their opinions are challenged by a different thinker in the room. And so sometimes what you're seeing is like, well, that's a fight response at times. Like someone's ego took a bruise and they're feeling like what they understand or what they know is being challenged. And instead of offering that's interesting, or I've not heard that before, I'd love to learn more, or how could we build on that idea, or how could we combine these ideas? It's instantly like, there's this sharpness. So sometimes it's not always about like put up your dukes, but it could also be different ways that these behaviors are manifesting. Did that help address the question?
Yeah, I think so. That was great. Thank you.
Thanks, Carlin. There was one more quick question. We have 2 minutes. There was one question about having some feelings or thoughts about everybody can learn a new skill. The person's comment was, having a disability, I know that I can't learn and do everything. So how do you kind of navigate that with young people if you're helping them to try and build and learn a new skill? It could be more difficult depending upon their circumstances.
Sure. Yep. Everyone has different abilities. So this idea of that skills is not always, there's not one way to accomplish how something gets done. And so there I would focus conversation on what other skills could help you get to this end game. What's the outcome you're trying to achieve? What's your end goal? And offer observations around like, well, it seems as though you've been putting a lot of emphasis into this particular pathway, this particular skill to accomplish the goal in this way. I wonder if we step back and think about some different routes we could take. What skills feel like are skills you have and skills that you could work on that would help you get to this place that you want to get?
Awesome. I love that, Carlin. Breaking it down and really empowering the young person to think about how they can address what's happening or what the situation is. That's awesome. All right. Well, we are at 12:59, and so I want to be sure to close our time together here. So we want to extend our gratitude to Carlin again for sharing her expertise with us. This has been amazing today. We want to thank all of you for the work you do on behalf of young people in Wisconsin. I am going to launch a 5-question poll. I'm hoping before you leave, you will take just a moment to respond to these questions. This feedback gives us additional information on future webinars and trainings and resources that we are able to make available. And I also put some additional information in the chat box. If you have questions or want to follow up on any of this content, you can email us at the network. You can sign up for our email list so that you can receive information about all of these upcoming opportunities in which you can participate. And I also put our website. So thank you all again. We appreciate you being here, and thanks, Carlin. You are a wealth of knowledge and information, and I think everyone very much appreciated you taking time to join us today.